Hello, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Smith, and I'm here to introduce you to a training program for new and experienced therapists. The course will be self-paced, online, and presented through multiple modalities. It's unique in that it isn't aligned with any school of therapy or orientation, but is compatible with all. The training runs parallel to the 22 chapters in my book, Psychotherapy, A Practical Guide. It's divided into 3 parts. The first gives a general understanding of how people get in trouble and how psychotherapy works. Then we work on how to conduct the therapy, and finally, a catalog of the vast range of problems that people will bring to your practice. In this first lesson, I want to give you a perspective on the course. I'll try to give you a sense of how you are going to come out with a much stronger ability to understand what's going on and what to do next, not just with one type of case or treatment modality, but with all kinds of pathology and a range of tools and techniques. First, let me share with you how I got here. It was the summer of 1977, and I was in my first job. I was supposed to interview a hospital patient for a group of students and discuss the case. Halfway into the interview, I must have hit a nerve, and the patient suddenly got up and walked out of the room. However, after a few minutes she came back. There was something about her determination to get help that touched me. I decided then that when she got out of the hospital I would take her on in psychotherapy. I soon learned that she had been traumatized at the hands of her psychotic mother. I also learned that she had dissociative identity disorder, which meant that the most terrible of her abuse was not accessible to consciousness. Her dread of re-experiencing her trauma took 4 years to overcome. When her memory finally opened up, her healing took only 2 sessions. What had been too dreadful to face now became a sad and dull ache. I might have been more surprised by her rapid healing, but it was exactly what Freud had described in the first case he wrote about. He called it catharsis. There were other traumas and more work to access them, but each time when they came to light with full emotion, the same rapid healing took place. However, as with almost every other trauma survivor, there was more. She suffered from deeply low self-esteem and internal resistance to succeeding in her life. This did not heal rapidly. It was a long struggle till she was able to finish college and go on to get a master's degree in social work. At that point, I had the conscious thought that I was witnessing 2 quite different pathways to healing in psychotherapy. One for the rapid healing of the traumatic events, and the other having to do with the low self-esteem. That's what started me on a quest to learn all I could about how therapy works. It was clear to me that understanding those mechanisms would be the key to being a better therapist. Originally, I was going to use this first lesson to give you a glimpse of the 7 keys that you would learn by the end of the course. I realized that throwing all that at you at once would be too much for one session, so I'll give you more of a sketch than an overview. There's a reason for that. The other day I was quite impressed with the complexity of the heat pump the repairman came to fix. Then I thought about us as therapists. We have the audacity to be service technicians for what has been called the most complex object in the universe. So while I intend to make it understandable, we need to recognize that there's a limit to how much we can simplify. Supposedly, Einstein said, "You should make things as simple as possible, but not simpler." That could be the motto of this course. Enough of my story. Now let's look at the field of psychotherapy. In the Middle Ages, there were academic schools. Each one sought to recruit disciples and did whatever they could to look better than other schools. That was because one person's idea was as good as the others. There was no good basis for agreement about which humors caused what illness or how to turn lead into gold. Gradually, a common understanding became established, and science moved to the next level, where schools were no longer competing like religions, but working to fill in the details of an agreed-upon foundation. Do you see how much our field is still like the schools of the Middle Ages? Each one has its own set of concepts and explanations, expressed in terms that belong to that school alone, and don't make sense in terms of the others. So what has happened is that the field has grown wonderful branches, leaves, and flowers, but still hasn't adopted a trunk or roots. Marvin Goldfried, co-founder of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, has recently restated the importance of finding a common core of knowledge that could link together different schools and orientations of therapy. So I'm here to tell you that while there's still some controversy, we now have enough science to support building a clinically solid picture of the infrastructure of mechanisms and processes that are common to all therapies. That's what you will learn here. Let's look at some of those branches in foliage. The psychodynamic orientation founded by Freud, perhaps more than any other point of view, has aimed to be universal in explaining all kinds of problems and how therapy can help. The foundation is Freud's brave assertion that our problems come from the unconscious mind. Modern neurophysiology has confirmed that, indeed, something like 95% of the information processing that goes on in the brain is outside of consciousness. Freud was a Victorian and saw the goal of advanced people as taming that unruly unconscious. I think we can be a bit more subtle now, a bit more humble, and less judgmental. The one time Freud mentioned Darwin, it was to point out how slowly new ideas are absorbed. He was so right about that, and it is Darwin's work that allows us to look at the unconscious in a more positive light. There is quite a bit of science to support the idea that consciousness is a small window in the operations of the mind, and that the mind as a whole is an organ that was essentially complete in its evolution about 200,000 years ago, shaped so as to identify and predict opportunities and threats, and to devise flexible responses to make the most of every situation, at least as it was back then. So now, let's look at how this course fits in with other therapies you may have learned about or experienced or just heard about. We'll borrow quite a bit from the psychodynamic theories derived from Freud's work. That's because that is where there's been the most experience with asking why the unconscious problem solver does what it does. One of the things the problem solver does is to produce automatic patterns of action along with conscious impulses to do things. When these actions are less healthy than some alternative ones, we want to change them. That's what behavior therapy tried to do, but it turned out to be harder than one might think. Why do people resist change for the good? I'll give you a hint. The non-conscious problem solver thinks that the irrational behavior was necessary for protection, and it naturally resists losing a valued protection. That's where CBT comes in, recognizing that individuals have their own irrational beliefs and values. That's correct, but we are going to be more persistent in asking why. What purpose do those irrational thoughts and values serve? Emotion-focused therapy was one of the first therapies to see the crucial importance of emotion. We will come to recognize the exact role of emotion in triggering maladaptive responses and in the action of psychotherapy. Polyvagal theory is especially focused on the fact that when patients are too intensely aroused, they don't learn or change. In recent years, the field has borrowed a lot from Eastern practices to understand how to quiet things down. Before that, the therapeutic relationship was our main tool, and it still is a very good one. Bowlby and his attachment theory were rejected at first, but contribute to our understanding of how in the first years of life, nonverbal children learn to adapt to their environment, and how those adaptations tend to perpetuate themselves. This was one of the first areas where it has been shown clearly that nurture has a great influence on personality and the ways we respond. While genetics and biological factors influence how we adapt, psychotherapy doesn't seek primarily to change those, but it does help to change how we respond. It aims to help us trade what we'll later call entrenched maladaptive patterns for more satisfactory ways of responding. Fonagy has promoted the idea of mentalization or mindfulness as the key to cure. We'll learn the neurophysiology of exactly how and why this plays an important role in the basic processes by which psychotherapy can lead to modification of maladaptive patterns. AEDP, that's Accelerated Experiential Dynamic Therapy, DBT, and ACT, that's acceptance and commitment therapy, are known as third-wave therapies. They each incorporate the three elements that are critical to the action of all therapies and are integral to the change mechanisms we depend on. Those three elements are good to remember. We'll come back to them many times. First, activation of the maladaptive pattern. Second, the antidote, exposure to an experience or knowledge that contradicts the maladaptive belief or response. And third, the presence of affect, which tells us that the relevant neural networks necessary for change are indeed in an activated state. Somatosensory therapy incorporates a relatively new recognition, especially in trauma, that, as van der Kolk puts it, the body keeps the score. And finally, with exposure therapy, the behavioral tradition has fully embraced the importance of the third of those three required elements, affect. And that is one of the three elements that were present when my patient finally recalled her traumatic experiences with full affect, and that's what led to her rapid healing. As on this slide, there are three main threads of science that form the basis of a new way to understand people's problems and how psychotherapy can support change. We already talked about Darwin. Eric Kandel helped to explain the amazing way that neural networks, groups of cells that tend to fire together and are defined by the strength of their synapses, are able to hold all the possible kinds of information that help the mind to adapt so flexibly and sometimes so dysfunctionally. And we'll learn a lot more about memory reconsolidation, because it is unique in that it is the only known way by which established maladaptive patterns can change rapidly and permanently without the need for further work to keep the new pattern in place. That's what happened. That was what was responsible for my patient's rapid healing. At the most fundamental level, there are only three ways that maladaptive patterns can change. One is for the mind to learn a new pattern. The second is extinction, a process by which the cortex learns to send inhibitory signals that block the expression of a dysfunctional pattern. Unfortunately, extinction is not permanent and requires work to maintain. And finally, we find memory reconsolidation, which we could describe as the queen of change mechanisms used in psychotherapy because it is rapid, permanent, and doesn't require effort to maintain. Interestingly, the same three conditions mentioned earlier are required for both extinction and for memory reconsolidation. So in doing therapy, we may not be able to tell right away which one is working, whether it's extinction or memory reconsolidation that is helping the patient to respond in a healthier way. Now, do you remember the three elements that allow modification of existing responses, either through extinction or memory reconsolidation? 1, the activation of the maladaptive pattern. 2, the antidote, exposure to an experience or knowledge that contradicts the maladaptive belief or response. And 3, the presence of affect, which tells us that the relevant neural networks necessary for change are indeed in an activated state. Therapists actually do more than what we've talked about so far. They do more than figure out what is going on, expose their patients to new learning, and seek those three conditions. There are 4 more important things we all do. I call them facilitative factors. First, we need to keep arousal within an optimal window. Second, therapy is hard, and every therapy has ways to support motivation, even if not overtly. 3, safety is the therapist's responsibility, both in making sure that patients are giving informed consent and that they are not being exposed to unnecessary danger. And finally, the therapeutic relationship participates in each of the 3 healing mechanisms and the other 3 facilitative factors. It's a kind of Swiss Army knife, and this very important relationship must be maintained and guarded. That's it. A quick look at how seeing the mind in a modern way, understanding the infrastructure of how patterns are kept, how change takes place, and looking at the aims we keep in mind as we work all add up to a way of approaching psychotherapy that applies to every case and helps us bring under one roof what you can learn from every school and orientation. This is a new program, and we are recruiting a group of new and experienced therapists to help refine our program. This pilot group will benefit from much closer contact with myself as we work together to give you an experience beyond your expectations. As shown on the slide, each of the 22 lessons will include a short video introduction, a chapter from Psychotherapy, a practical guide, a lively podcast to accompany the subject matter of the chapter, a group video session to answer student questions, access to a growing library of video answers to common questions, and an optional test leading to certification. We'll be in touch to learn if you're one of the ones who might benefit from this unique opportunity. So I'm glad you're still with me. Thank you, and bye for now.